The billionaire's son failed all his exams, and he was desperate. He tried to hide it, tried to justify it, even tried to lie. But nothing could erase the shame etched on the returned tests, nor the fear that gnawed at his heart. He knew his father didn't accept failure. In that household, perfection was the bare minimum. Results were a must. Anything less was seen as weakness. He spent sleepless nights sweating, rehearsing 1,000 ways to tell the truth, but none of them felt safe. His father was a businessman who treated his son like a spreadsheet. Make a profit or be cut. Every look from him was a silent demand, a reminder that everything had been built for him, and that it was his job to prove he deserved it. And he failed. But what no one expected was that the only person capable of helping him at that moment didn't wear a suit or a diploma. She wore a simple uniform, carried a wheeled bucket, and passed invisibly through the mansion's marble corridors. And yet, she saw what no one else saw. The cleaning lady who collected the luxury leftovers every day was the only one to notice the sadness in the boy's eyes. He didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. A second of silence between them was enough for her to know he needed help. But what she did no one could have ever imagined. She called him aside, not with harsh words, with a gentle gesture as if offering a secret. And she said, "You just need to see the world differently. That's how I got through, when everyone said I couldn't." He laughed. He was suspicious. But there was something unfamiliar in her voice, Faith. This was new, in that home of demands and pressure. This unknown woman offered confidence. She didn't have books. She didn't have a whiteboard. She didn't have modern methods. But what she did have was something he'd never received real attention. The technique she taught didn't come from a textbook. It came from within, something she'd used since she was 16, when she studied sitting on the floor of the public cafeteria, her eyes glued to crumpled paper. A technique that transformed letters and numbers into feelings. A technique that, if he embraced it, could change everything. And he surrendered. At first it seemed strange. He thought it was just another failed attempt. But little by little, the words began to make sense. The formulas became logical. The texts stopped being a monster. It was as if finally he could see clearly. And for the first time, he believed he could. The result: the boy who had failed. Everything was now among the best. He passed handily. He got what was previously impossible. The teachers were shocked. The whole school started talking. And his father didn't understand a thing. How did someone who had always failed suddenly blossom? That's when the biggest revelation came. The cleaning lady's technique wasn't just a memorization trick. It was the same method she herself had used to get off the streets, a method that almost got her into Harvard. Yes, that woman, invisible to everyone, was once the most promising student of her generation, until something stopped her, something that to this day she has never told anyone. The boy now carries this secret, and upon discovering the woman's past, he finds himself faced with a choice: reveal to the world who really saved her, or continue pretending it was his own doing. But the most shocking thing was yet to come. When the father discovers everything, his world is turned upside down. He who always believed that money could buy everything now has to admit that he failed his own son, and that he was saved by someone he didn't even know the name of. What could have happened to this woman? Why did she abandon everything, even with a bright future ahead of her? And how will this unlikely reunion between two such different worlds transform not only the boy, but the entire power structure of this family? A story where failure gives way to overcoming, where the invisible becomes essential, and where the greatest gesture of transformation does not come from above, but from those who have always been ignored. But after all, who was this woman? And why did she hide for so many years that she had a talent capable of changing lives? That answer, only those who stay until the end will find out. Welcome to Tales of Twist, the channel where every story ends in a way you never expect. Before you start, subscribe to the channel, like it, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any twists and turns. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is more than surprising, and it's hair-raising. Now, let's get to the story. Welcome to Tales of Twist, the channel where every story ends in a way you never expect. Before you start, subscribe to the channel, like it, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any twists and turns. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is more than surprising. It's hair-raising. Now yes, let's get to the story. The mansion where everything happened seemed like a universe apart. Hidden among discreet hills on the outskirts of Charlotte in North Carolina, the automatic gate opened slowly, as if to say to the visitor, here everything has time and value. Surrounded by high walls, cameras at every corner, and a security line that never slumbered, the family home Jefferson, it was a clear symbol of power, silence, and isolation. Inside, everything gleamed. The hallways carried the constant scent of imported wax, the carpets came from countries with names only bankers know, and the walls were adorned with artwork that probably cost more than entire houses in ordinary neighborhoods. Everything had been chosen with pinpoint precision, except perhaps one thing: the owner's son. Miles Jefferson, he was 17 years old. Tall, thin, his hair always neatly trimmed, but with a look that never matched his surroundings. He wasn't arrogant, nor was he rebellious. He was what many would call a silent, broken boy. Miles lived trapped between the surname he bore and the silence he cultivated. The only son of Caleb Jefferson, a tech mogul, who built an empire with his own hands at the age of 27, Miles grew up surrounded by everything money can buy, and the absence of everything money can't deliver. From an early age, Miles was enrolled in the best schools, trained with the best tutors, and enrolled in the most demanding courses. He had private lessons in languages, piano, robotics, and even formal etiquette. But none of these lessons taught him how to approach his father. Caleb was the type who was never late, who drank coffee standing up between connections, and who treated every meeting with his own son like a results presentation. In their house, any conversation could sound like a report. There were no family dinners, just brief performance updates. Miles tried, even if silently. He tried to conform to what was expected of him. He was afraid of disappointing. He carried the weight of his name, the weight of his inheritance, the weight of expectations, and still he failed. At school, his grades fluctuated like waves in a rough sea, not for lack of effort, but because despite all the structure, he never understood that kind of learning. Everything felt empty, mechanical, as if there was no room for him to be himself. Meanwhile, on the other side of the mansion, on the floor, below, there was someone who went unnoticed, but who knew the house better than any member of the family. His name was Clara Davis, a 56-year-old woman with sun-scarred skin, steady hands, and a watchful gaze. Clara had been the cleaning lady at that residence for over 7 years. She arrived at 6 in the morning and left after 7 at night. She walked the hallways like a silent shadow, knowing the rhythm of the house like a conductor knows every note of his score. Clara came from southern Georgia, where she was raised by her grandparents in a small wooden house. Life was never easy, but she learned to be strong. She raised 2 children alone, and after the death of her eldest daughter, took on the care of her granddaughter. Ours, a bright girl who dreamed of studying psychology at Howard. Clara wasn't just an employee. She was an observer. And within that mansion of cold silences, she saw more than anyone let on. She knew when Mr. Jefferson was in a bad mood by the way he locked his car. She knew when Mrs. Jefferson, who rarely appeared, had stopped by the scent of perfume lingering in the air. And she knew something was wrong with the boy. She could see the weariness in Miles's eyes, the crumpled notebook pages discarded in the trash, the way he retreated deeper into himself. But no one there talked about feelings, not in that world. The private school Miles attended was more like a CEO incubator than an educational institution. Impeccable students, luxurious facilities, constant competition for recognition. Miles didn't stand out. Not for lack of intelligence, he had brilliant insights, but they were scattered. As if the knowledge were all there but locked behind doors no one ever taught him how to open. The teachers, while acknowledging their difficulties, also had their own demands. They expected excellence, and as always their last name mattered. He's Caleb Jefferson's son, he can't get anything lower than an A. And as his grades began to plummet, so did the way people looked. Miles became the target of whispers and veiled jokes, and the pressure, which was already enormous, now seemed unbearable. Caleb, upon hearing the grades, didn't explode. He simply said, looking into his son's eyes, "Fix this. I will not tolerate incompetence." That was all. But for Miles, those 4 words hurt, more than any scream. Meanwhile at the mansion, Clara continued her invisible routine. She scrubbed the marble bathrooms with the same care one would handle a jewel. Always wearing headphones, she listened to old radio stations, talk shows, and sometimes audiobooks on history, psychology, and philosophy. She never stopped learning. Clara believed that knowledge was the one thing no one could take from her, and even though the world had turned its back on her in the past, she carried a burning flame in her heart, the certainty that education was power. In that house she had seen it all. Silent betrayals, hushed fights, sophisticated lies, but the sadness in Miles's eyes made her uneasy. She recognized that look. It was the same one she'd had when at 17 she'd almost given up on her own dreams. But Miles didn't know that. To him, Clara was just the woman who cleaned the floor. The following days were dark. Miles withdrew even further from everything. He spent long hours silently in his room, drawing random doodles, listening to melancholic playlists, trying to find some escape. Until one of those grey afternoons he went down to the kitchen and heard something he'd never heard in that house before. Clara singing softly. It was an old, soulful song. Something about that melody made him stop. She didn't see him. She continued, singing as she organized the cleaning closet. Miles approached slowly, not with words, with curiosity. For the first time he wanted to know something that wasn't in the books, something human. It was there in the unlikely encounter between 2 worlds that should never have crossed that destiny, began to chart its own course. A silent path, built by small gestures, subtle glances, and a trust that would slowly blossom. And while Caleb prepared a new round of meetings and goals for his son there in the corner of the kitchen, an invisible woman began to change everything, without anyone noticing. Yet, the next morning, Miles woke before his alarm. It was still dark outside, but something inside him pulsed with an unease he couldn't name. The silent encounter with Clara the previous afternoon had left a lump in his throat. For the first time, someone in that house had made him feel seen. Breakfast proceeded as usual. Dad sat at the head of the table reading reports on a tablet. Chewing slowly, the cook served silently, and Miles pretended he wasn't dying inside. Caleb looked over his glasses as if evaluating a stock. "Today you're going to the tutoring class. 5 p.m. and I don't want any excuses." "Yes, sir," Miles replied, his voice low, almost swallowed by his cup of coffee. But Miles didn't go to his tutor's class. At 4:45 p.m., he was in the mansion's pantry watching Clara rearrange bottles of cleaning products. "You sing well," he said, his voice trembling. She turned around, surprised. "And you hear well?" He gave a nervous smile. "Yesterday, that song, was it from your childhood?" Clara paused for a second. "It was my war. Everyone has their own, don't they?" There was silence. Miles leaned against the wall. Late afternoon light filtered in through the blinds. "Do you think it's possible to become something even when everyone already sees you as a failure?" Clara didn't answer right away. She dried her hands on the cloth and pulled up a chair. "Tell me something, Miles. Why do you think you failed?" "I am not good enough. I try, but I can't. My father says I'm weak. And, maybe he's right." She looked at him, with a firmness no one in there had ever used. "You're not weak, you're drowning, and no one taught you how to swim." His eyes widened. "But how do you learn that?" She got up and took a dusty box from the back of the closet. "Give me an hour. If you're up for it, I'll show you what they did to me. It won't be easy, but if you have the courage to really try, maybe you'll find out you're not broken. You're just trying to use the wrong key to open the right door." And so it began. Every afternoon, secretly, while his father thought his son was at tutoring, Miles would meet Clara in the back of the laundry room. She would make him sit on the floor. She would open old notebooks, show him hand-drawn diagrams, and tell stories about how she used colors, sounds, and symbols to transform words into mental images. She called it the living memory method. Miles laughed at first. He found it strange to associate formulas with characters, texts with songs. But when he realized that days later he still remembered everything they'd studied, he stopped doubting. He began taking notes, questioning, making connections on his own. For the first time, he was understanding, not memorizing, understanding. But the secret weighed heavily. During dinner, Caleb commented on the tutor's reports, proud of his invented progressors. "At least you're not embarrassing me anymore, kid. Keep it up." And Miles swallowed hard, his stomach churning, not out of fear but out of guilt. He wanted to tell the truth. He wanted to scream that it was Clara who was saving him. But he also knew what his father would do if he found out. At school, results began to change. Tests that had previously come back red now came back full of positive reviews. One teacher even commented, "Miles, your development is remarkable." "What happened?" He hesitated. "I started to see things differently." Among the students, the mood was also changing. Once mocked, he was now regarded with a certain respect. But the insecurity was still there. With every sidelong glance, every hushed whisper, Miles felt like everything could fall apart, and Clara knew it. "You need to breathe, boy," she said during one of the sessions. "But if he finds out, if he knows, he will know. Everything is revealed in its own time, and you will be ready." One day, Miles arrived at the laundromat and found Clara with an envelope in her hands. "What is that?" "Your next test, a mock exam. I got it from your coordinator. She said you needed to practice. Let's see if we're really on track." He did the entire test there in silence. When he finished, Clara took the paper, read it, reread it, and smiled. "You got everything right." "All." She nodded. "You are ready." He took a deep breath. For the first time, he felt pride, but also fear, because now there were no more excuses. Days later, Caleb announced that he would host a dinner at his home for a select group of investors. "And you, Miles, will be there. I want you to start getting used to the big business environment." "But must I have a school presentation that same night?" "Uncheck it. Nobody gets rich from school presentations." Miles looked down. "Yes, sir." On dinner night, the house was filled with well-dressed people, fake smiles, and coded conversations. Clara moved discreetly among them, collecting glasses with the elegance of someone watching a game they already know by heart. Miles showed up as his father had hoped, but he didn't stay. At the first opportunity, he slipped out the side of the house and ran to school, his presentation papers crumpled inside his backpack. And that night, it shone. He gave a speech about learning, about method, about empathy. He presented simple solutions to common high school challenges. Everyone was silent. Some filmed. One teacher cried. At the end, he thanked everyone, to a person who taught me to see the world with different eyes. The next day, the video of the presentation had already circulated among the school's parents. One of the investors present the night before met Caleb. "I saw your boy yesterday. Brilliant. That method he used, is it something new on the market?" Caleb was confused. "Method?" "Yes, that learning method. It caught my attention. I thought you had something to do with it." Caleb's face hardened. He had no idea what they were talking about. That afternoon, he called Miles into the office. "You lied to me. You didn't go to dinner, and you presented something that didn't come from any tutor I paid." Miles stared at his father. "She was the one who taught me, Clara. The cleaning lady. She's not just that. You don't know who she is. And you subjected yourself to this." "Father." "I didn't submit. I finally stood up." Caleb rose from his chair, visibly shaken. He had never seen his son so composed. "I want to know what she did. I want all the details." Miles hesitated. "Then you'll have to listen. Like you've never listened to anyone before." And in that moment, without realizing it, Caleb took the first step toward a truth that would change everything he thought he knew. But what Miles didn't yet know was that Clara was hiding a story neither of them was ready to hear. A story involving choices, losses, and a past that was about to be irreversibly revealed. And when that past comes to light, nothing in that house will be the same again. The rain was falling lightly as Miles descended the last few steps to the basement. The lights in the mansion had almost completely dimmed. Upstairs, Caleb was still in his office reviewing reports. But here in the Basement hidden beneath such luxury, another meeting was about to take place. Clara waited for him sitting on an old bench next to a shelf with rags and buckets. Her hands clasped, her face calm. He seemed to know what was coming. Miles, panting, sat down across from her. "He wants to hear from you." She looked up. "And you, I've heard. But I think there's more." She remained silent for a few seconds. Then she took a deep breath, as if revisiting a past she'd rather leave dormant. "Then it's time." In the office, the tension was thick as the air before a storm. Caleb stood arms crossed, waiting for Clara to enter. She walked slowly to the center of the room. Her wet shoes left light tracks on the Persian rug. Miles closed the door behind them and leaned against it, watching. Caleb was direct. "I want to know exactly how you transformed my son's performance. What did you do?" Clara looked up. Her voice was firm, but not arrogant. "I showed him what no one had the patience to show him, that he thinks differently and that this is not a flaw." Caleb stepped forward. "You have no academic training. You're not a teacher. How could you dare interfere with his development without my consent, because your son was choking? And I already knew what that was like. You think I don't care about him? I don't think so. I just think you never stopped to listen to the sound of his pain, and maybe that's because your own pain always screamed louder." Miles felt a lump in his throat. Caleb looked away as if struck. But then he quickly regained his composure. "What intrigues me is your confidence, that technique, that way of teaching. It doesn't seem like something you learn cleaning hallways." Clara then walked to the bookshelf and picked up an old book with a yellowed cover. She placed it on the table. It was a notebook. Caleb leafed through it suspiciously until he found the first page, Active Memory System, Clara A. Davis, 1986. He read it twice before speaking. "Did you write this? Try." "At which university?" She looked him in the eyes. "None." A thick silence fell. Clara took another step closer. "I was a teenager when I developed this. I went to night school at a public school in Savannah. My parents died young. I took care of my siblings, cleaned houses during the day, and studied with whatever energy I had left." Caleb said nothing. His eyes were fixed on his notebook. "I made this material for myself. It was the only way I could keep up with the class. I had no books, just what I copied. So I created this system. I associated ideas, feelings, visual patterns. My results soared. I won a state writing competition, a logic competition. I almost got into Harvard." Miles moved involuntarily, surprised. Clara continued. "But something happened, something that stopped me." Now his voice was no longer firm. It was low, almost a whisper. "I was in the final selection process for a scholarship. I had done everything right. But at the last meeting on campus, a guy followed me to the library. He said people like me didn't belong there. He locked me in the study room. He tried to—" She stopped. "He tried to shut me up. Afraid I was smarter than him." Caleb frowned. "Who was that boy?" She hesitated. "He was the son of an investor in the university, the one you represent to this day." Caleb seemed to search his memory. "Did you file a complaint, sir?" "I tried, but he had a name. I only had my notebook. What happened to him, so he became dean? And you gave up?" "No, I was stopped." Clara was silent for a moment, her eyes lowered. "That broke me. I walked away. I worked where I could. I raised my children. I lost my daughter to violence. I care for my granddaughter. And I hid that notebook in the bottom of a box. Until one day, I saw your son throwing his own notebook in the trash, and I understood everything." Caleb was stunned. Miles across the room felt the air leave his lungs. This system wasn't created in a laboratory. It was created out of necessity, out of survival, and it worked. Not because it's sophisticated, but because it respects those who learn differently. And that's all your son needed. Someone who respected his way of life. Caleb turned to Miles. "You hid this from me." "Why?" Miles replied in a firm but emotional voice. "Because I knew you wouldn't listen, that you would only see numbers, spreadsheets, and she listened to me." The silence became so intense that it was possible to hear the raindrops hitting the window. Caleb sat up slowly. He looked back at his notebook, then at Clara. "Do you still have All this stored away on every line. And you never tried to publicize it. I tried. But no one wanted to listen to a cleaning lady. Caleb ran his hand over his face as if trying to erase the last 20 years. And now, you decide what to do with this. He stood there motionless. Miles walked over and placed the notebook back in Clara's hands. You won't hide this anymore. Clara stared at the boy. Her eyes were teary. Are you sure? More than ever. Caleb then stood up. He walked to the window. He looked out at the sodden garden. The lights from the mansion reflected in the puddles. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost fragile. I always thought I knew everything, that I could predict plan control, but now I realize I didn't even listen to my own son. And that, maybe, I've become just like the man who stopped you from moving forward. Clara didn't answer. She let him listen to his own silence. Caleb turned to her. I want you to help me move this forward. I want your technique to be recognized. I want this system to be taught. I want no one else to have to go through what you went through. She swallowed hard. Do you have any idea what you're saying? I do, and for the first time. It's not an order. It's a request. Miles smiled. Small, shy, but real. The cleaning lady at Charlotte's most luxurious house now had something before her that not even she expected recognition, not as an efficient employee, but as a brilliant mind that the world tried to silence. And beside her a boy who finally learned to listen to himself. But there was still one last decision to be made, and it carried consequences that no one in that room was prepared to face. Because when the living memory system came to light, someone would have a lot to lose. And that, someone's name was written on the first page of the notebook, scrawled angrily over 20 years ago. The only thing left to know was what Clara would do with this information. That same night the mansion was already asleep when Clara returned to the laundry room alone. The notebook remained closed in her hands as if each page was still alive, pulsing with memories of a life she'd tried to bury. What Caleb had said echoed in her head: recognition, voice, atonement. But along with it came the other side exposure. Fear, and the memory of the face of that man who'd tried to silence her decades ago. Meanwhile, Miles walked slowly upstairs. The encounter in the office had shaken him in a way he couldn't explain. That night had been like ripping off a blindfold he hadn't even known he was wearing. For the first time, his father had listened. Not just to him, but to the truth behind the woman who had always gone unnoticed. Still, he sensed something was about to happen. Something big. Something that still had no name. 2 days later, the mood in the house was different. Clara's presence, always invisible, was now noticeable. Staff whispered in the hallways, speculating about what was happening. Caleb began cancelling meetings. He called lawyers, educators, old acquaintances. He was preparing something, and it was becoming evident. On Saturday morning, Miles woke up to an envelope on his desk. Inside was a letter bearing the Harvard University coat of arms. He read it slowly. It was an informal invitation to present the learning method he had used in his recent lecture at the school. A campus researcher had seen the video, which had quietly gone viral in some academic circles. At the bottom of the letter, in small print, "We would also like to meet the creator of the method." Miles ran downstairs and found Caleb in the reading room talking on the phone. He didn't wait for his father to hang up. "Did you see that?" Caleb nodded, turning off the device. "Yes, I've already booked the trip." "Did you talk to her?" "Not yet." Hours later, they met again in the office. Clara was sitting, her notebook still with her, but now surrounded by new papers. Caleb had hired a team to digitize and organize the material. He was taking it all seriously, but Clara was still reticent. "Harvard, isn't it?" she said, leafing through the newly printed sheets. Caleb nodded. "They want to hear from you, just as they should have done 30 years ago." She kept her eyes on the paper. "What if he's still there?" Miles frowned. "Who?" She closed the notebook. "The man who tried to kill me. He's a member of the university board. Today, if I show up, he'll know." Caleb got up from his chair. "Clara, now it's different. It's not that simple." Miles then stepped forward. It's not just about him. It's about what you created, and about all the people who can still be helped. You saved me, and you can save so many others. She looked at him for a long time. What if this time he tries to silence me again? You won't be able to, because now you're not alone. She took a deep breath. Finally, she nodded. 2 weeks later, the scene was completely different. A small conference room in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle. At one of the tables sat researchers, pedagogical coordinators, and university board members. Among them was a man in a dark suit with graying hair, the same man Clara recognized immediately, even after all these years. It was him, Frederick Stanton, the name she never forgot. When Clara entered the room, Miles at her side, the air seemed to freeze for a moment. Frederick saw her, and the shock was masked by a political smile, the kind used when the past appears uninvited. Caleb accompanied them, but stood in the back, watching. Clara walked with firm steps to the central table. Her eyes remained straight, but inside her hands trembled. The presentation began. Miles spoke first, demonstrating how he used the method to transform his own trajectory. Then he handed the floor to Clara. She began slowly explaining how the system was born. She spoke of real experiences, of the names of young people who might have been lost in the traditional school system. She explained the colors, the sounds, the memory triggers. She spoke clearly, confidently, truthfully. Frederick shifted in his chair. He crossed his arms. He scratched his chin. The discomfort was obvious. And then came the last question. Mrs. Davis, why have you never tried to submit this material before? Clara hesitated. She looked at Caleb, then at Miles, and finally she answered, because 31 years ago a man showed me that this was not my place. The room fell silent. I was attacked here, locked in a room, and when I tried to report it, no one listened to me. He was untouchable, and I was just a young black girl from the South. Frederick stirred. Are you implying something, madam? She turned to him. For the first time she spoke directly. I'm not insinuating. I'm saying it was you. A murmur ran through the room. Someone dropped a pen. Miles stood up. She never talked about it, not even to me. But I saw what she went through to get here. Frederick tried to defend himself. That's an absurd accusation. There's no evidence. Caleb stepped forward. There's something stronger than proof, Stanton. There's testimony. And now there are eyes on you. It won't happen again. The session coordinator urged calm. He wrote down every word. He assured them there would be a formal investigation, and he closed the meeting. On their way out, Miles and Clara walked silently across campus. The cold was biting, but there was something warm inside them, freedom Clara no longer needed to hide. And Miles finally saw justice being served before his very eyes. Hours later, at a cafe near the university, Caleb called Clara to talk. I wanted to ask you something. She looked at him, surprised. I want to fund this project. I want you to coordinate the expansion of your method. I want to set up a foundation in your name, a learning center, with teachers trained by you, with your system, your way. Clara took a while to respond. Are you sure about this? More than I have ever had from any business in my life. She smiled, a small smile, almost incredulous. And why do you want to do this now? Because, and for the first time, I saw what money alone cannot build. You gave my son something that I, with all my resources, could not achieve. She nodded. Then let's do it. But do it the right way. Slowly, carefully, and with soul. With soul. And there, at that simple table, a new future was born. The past could not be changed, but what would come next would be. Written by other hands, the news spread like wildfire, first discreetly through internal notes and informal communications between university departments. Then on education-focused websites, small portals began publishing excerpts from Clara's presentation, and in less than a week, the story crossed campus boundaries, reaching blogs, podcasts, and social media. A cleaning lady develops an innovative teaching method and moves Harvard. Miles Jefferson, son of a tech billionaire, reveals he was saved by an invisible woman. Revelation about attempted abuse shakes board member. The headlines multiplied. But for Clara, what was unfolding was nothing new. It was simply the continuation of a story she had been silently facing for 3 decades. The difference now was that the world was listening, and that in itself was an irreversible transformation. Back in Charlotte, the routine at the Jefferson mansion had changed. Clara was no longer just Clara. Now she had an office upstairs near the library. Caleb had insisted that she needed her own space to develop the foundation project, a place that was hers. But what Clara needed most at that moment was time. The foundation was being registered. Lawyers and educators were meeting to design the program's first pilot. Interviews, educational events, and proposals for publishing the method were being invited. And yet Clara remained steadfast with the same demeanor, as always focused, calm, attentive. To detail, she preferred to plan in silence rather than celebrate in public. Miles, on the other hand, seemed lighter, more present. He participated in meetings, offered ideas, organized files, but he still carried a dilemma within himself, something he hadn't yet voiced either to Clara or to his father. One evening they were sitting in the mansion's backyard garden after another meeting with the foundation's leaders. The breeze was mild, and the smell of wet earth hung in the air. "Aren't you happy?" Clara asked, without taking her eyes off the stars. "I am Draz, but there is one thing." She waited. "I became the face of this story. People watch the videos, read the articles, and think I created it all. Some people call me a genius." She turned around. "And you feel guilty about that. It's not mine, it's yours. Miles, what you did with what you learned was authentic. You breathed new life into what had been stagnant for years. I would never have been heard if it weren't for you." He shook his head. "But the thing is, there's a part of me that doesn't want this place. I don't want to become a symbol of something that doesn't belong to me. And I also don't want to stop helping. Then maybe it's time to think about what you want, without having to carry the obligation of saving or representing anyone, just what you want." Miles was silent. This was a question he had never allowed himself to ask. Meanwhile, the accusation against Frederick Stanton gained momentum. The university launched an internal investigation. Other accounts began to emerge. Women from different eras, some in prominent positions, others anonymous, decided to share their experiences. The case was no longer isolated. It became a movement. And Clara's name, despite being constantly cited, remained a symbol of dignity. She did not give in to anger. She responded clearly with presence. She never shouted, never played the victim. But she also never lowered her eyes. Caleb, for his part, was going through a less public but equally transformative process. Gradually, he began to reevaluate his own history. He began to participate more in Miles's life, though with some emotional difficulty. He didn't know exactly how to act without seeming controlling. At times he still misspoke. But now he listened. And when he did, he acknowledged it. That in itself was progress. One afternoon, the two were in the house's screening room, watching a documentary about alternative education. Miles sat with a notebook on his lap, taking notes. Caleb watched. "Are you thinking of pursuing an academic career?" he asked. Miles shrugged. "Maybe, but not now. I insisted too much that you be someone you didn't want to be. You thought it was right. I thought so. Now I see that I confused leadership with imposition. People often confuse these two things. And you, if it were your son, what would you do differently?" Miles thought. "I would listen more, and I would accept that he might not be a better version of me, but a complete version of himself." Caleb smiled, not that rehearsed meeting smile, but a tired, sincere smile. "You've grown a lot. You let me grow up." The following week, a new dilemma arose. Frederick Stanton's name would be removed from the board. But in my exchange, he demanded that everything be done confidentially. He wanted to resign quietly, without fanfare, without admitting guilt. In exchange, he would make way for the foundation's initial funding. The decision was taken to Clara. She sat at The table in the new room now surrounded by files and notepads. Miles and Caleb stood nearby. If we accept, he leaves, but no one will know why. He clears his own name. But the project moves forward. She looked at both of them. What if we don't accept? Caleb replied. He threatens to file a defamation lawsuit and drag the case out for years. That could bring everything to a standstill. And you? She asked. Miles was the first to speak. The choice is yours, but I don't think it's worth paying that price with silence. Not again. She nodded. And you, Caleb? He hesitated. I would do whatever it takes for the foundation to exist, but if you want to fight to the end, I'll fight with you. Clara stood up and walked to the window. Charlotte's sky was tinged with gold. Outside, children played in the street. She thought of her granddaughter. She thought of the girls, who would one day be young like her. He turned around firm. Then let's go all the way. He'll leave, but he'll leave with a bad reputation because that's what he built. I'm not the one who destroys it. Caleb took a deep breath. I'll talk to the lawyers. The days that followed, Clara gave her first interview on national television. She spoke calmly without pre-planned speeches. She said she wasn't thirsting for revenge, but for truth. She said her method was just a tool, and that the true impact came when listening was more important than demanding. And she concluded with a quote that would be heard around the country within hours. The biggest mistake in education is not teaching wrongly. It's not teaching how to see the other. As he watched it on his cell phone screen, Miles felt a tear fall without asking permission. It wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about grades anymore. It was about breaking cycles, about dusting off the invisible. The foundation began to take shape. Low-income public schools showed interest. Renowned educators offered to help. Clara was slowly reshaping the path of so many others like her, like Miles, who had been overlooked for thinking differently. But in the midst of all this, a letter arrived. Not by email, not by text. A physical letter, beige envelope, no return address. Clara opened it with firm hands. It was his. They, Frederick Stanton. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't acknowledge any mistake. But it did confess fear. He said he hadn't slept well since he saw her enter that room, and that in the last few days he had relived it all. The act, the silence, the cowardice. At the end, a short, isolated sentence, "You won because you kept going." Clara calmly folded the paper. She looked outside. And then the phone rang. It was the National Education Committee. They wanted her to speak at the opening of the FI Conference on Pedagogical Inclusion the following year. Charlotte's cleaning lady, the girl on the library floor, the woman who refused to erase her own history. Now he was about to step onto the most important stage of his life. But what would she say there? That would be the next big decision, and perhaps the greatest of all. In the month leading up to the National Education Congress, Clara immersed herself in a world she'd never imagined inhabiting. Meetings with event curators, conversations with renowned educators, endlessly scheduled interviews. It was as if everything she'd silently built for decades was now being forcibly pulled to center stage. And she knew with every fiber of her being that she couldn't just stand there to tell a pretty story. It needed purpose, depth. It needed to transcend the passing emotion and provoke concrete change. She didn't want to be read as an exception, as a folkloric symbol of overcoming. She wanted to be recognized as an author, a mentor, a builder of a living pedagogy. And above all, she wanted to pave the way so that other voices, black, female, and from the periphery, would never have to wait 3 decades to be heard. As the Foundation's team grew and the first pilot school entered the adaptation phase to her method, Clara spent long hours locked in the mansion's office, now converted into her think tank. He rewrote his speech by hand, cutting sections, adding ideas, sometimes tearing up the entire page and starting over. What he wanted to say needed to be as powerful as it was true, and that required time, listening, and courage. Around the same time, Miles began attending small community schools outside Charlotte. He wanted to better understand who the students impacted by the method that had changed his own life would be. During one of his visits, he met a 13-year-old boy named Malik, who struggled with reading and was constantly sent out of class. The exhausted teacher confessed to Miles that he had tried everything, but the boy seemed unapproachable. Miles didn't respond immediately. He simply asked to speak with Malik for 5 minutes. He took the boy to the empty courtyard, sat on the floor with him, and took a pen and paper from his pocket. He drew a simple picture, a sort of map, and explained how the image association memory technique worked. After a few minutes, Malik not only understood the content he had been stuck on, but completed the entire exercise without help. Miles didn't shout, didn't celebrate. He simply smiled and said, "You're not the problem, they were just trying to teach you the wrong way." When he returned home that night, he found Clara on the couch, exhausted, with dozens of notes from the speech scattered around her. He sat beside her and told her what had happened with Malik, and for the first time since everything had begun, she cried. But it was a silent cry without despair, a cry that was more of release than pain. The following week, Clara received a call that heightened tension within the mansion. The university where Frederick Stanton served as a counselor had decided not only to accept his permanent resignation, but also to release a public statement acknowledging reports of harassment and violence from former students, including Clara's. Her name would be officially recorded in the institution's archives as a victim in a landmark case of institutional negligence. Miles, upon reading the draft statement, was furious. He thought it was not enough. He thought the university should have formally punished him, stripped him of his honors, done something more concrete. But Clara interrupted him with a calmness that came from elsewhere. He said, "There are things we can't overcome the way we want. But just the fact that they're writing that I exist is already more than I've had my entire life." Miles swallowed hard. This woman who had been erased for so many years was now teaching the son of a billionaire what raw dignity was. As the day of the conference approached, rehearsals for the speech intensified. Clara's team suggested technical adjustments, pauses, and vocabulary changes to facilitate comprehension for a wider audience. But she was firm. She wanted to keep her words as she intended, with the cadence of the South, with a language marked by life. She said, "If they've heard me my way up until now, I'm not going to try to sound like someone else now." And no one dared argue. Miles watched it all with an admiration that grew with each passing day. It was no longer about gratitude. It was reverence. Because he finally understood that this wasn't a favor she'd done him. It was a legacy that was now also his duty to protect. The day before her trip to the conference, Clara went to the school where she had studied in her youth. The building was dilapidated, some of the windows broken, the wall covered in graffiti, but the courtyard, though covered in dust, retained its original shape. She sat on a concrete bench, the same one where she used to handwrite summaries with a borrowed pencil. She looked around as if searching for ghosts and whispered, "I'm back." She didn't need to say anything else. On the way back, she stopped at a small bookstore and bought 3 blank notebooks. When she got home, she handed one to Miles. "I want you to start writing your method. Not mine, yours. One day someone will need it." Miles held the notebook as if entrusted with a sacred trust. Clara wasn't just passing a baton, she was blazing a trail. On the morning of the conference, the main hall of the Washington, D.C. Convention Center was packed. More than 1,000 educators, researchers, and students filled every inch of the seats. The lights were bright, and the screens displayed the conference name in giant letters: Education and Innovation, New Paths for an Old System. Miles sat in the front row next to Caleb, who wore a simpler suit than usual. They were both tense but silent. When Clara took the stage wearing a simple navy blue outfit and holding only a folded piece of paper, the room fell silent. She began her speech without formality. She didn't thank the authorities. She didn't mention protocol. She simply began to tell a story. She spoke of a girl who sat on the floor to study because the chairs were occupied by faster students. She spoke of a mind that saw connections where teachers saw distraction. She spoke of the day she was called stupid for getting her multiplication tables wrong, and how that same week she wrote a history summary that moved the librarian. People listened in absolute silence. Then she spoke of creating a method for survival, and how that method had been locked in a box for years, not because it was bad, but because no one wanted to listen. At the end, Clara paused for a moment, looked at the audience and said, When people ask me if I'm the woman who taught a billionaire's son to learn, I say no. I'm the woman who taught a boy to believe he already knew, he just needed to be heard. The right way. What I did for him, I do for you today. Listen to the children. Listen to those who are different. Because teaching isn't about molding, it's about revealing. The hall erupted in applause. People stood. Some wept openly. Miles couldn't hold back his tears. Caleb swallowed several times before standing and applauding too. Clara stepped off the stage with the same calm as always. No posing, no rush. But with a new weight on her shoulders, the weight of now being a national figurehead. Backstage journalists tried to get close. Organizers wanted to take her to a press conference. But she asked for a minute. She left through a side door, walked to an empty hallway, and leaned against the wall. Miles found her there. "You made history," he said. She looked at him with a short smile. The story was already made. All that was left was to be told. He took a deep breath. "I have been thinking about pursuing a career in educational psychology." She raised an eyebrow. "And even, I want to work with kids like Malik, people who think differently, people the system forgets." She put her hand on his shoulder. "Then go, but go in one piece, because only those who have been forgotten can truly teach the importance of remembering." As the two walked back to the auditorium, Caleb stood waiting for them. His look wasn't one of corporate pride. It was one of transformation. He was looking at his son, and the woman who had taught him more in weeks than any business school could. The world was no longer the same, and neither were they. But there was still one final choice to be made. One last switch Clara needed to decide whether to turn, because days before the conference, she had received a proposal from a large educational conglomerate to transform her method into a global franchise, exclusive material, million-dollar contracts, total control, and complete anonymity regarding her origins. If she accepted, she would guarantee financial security for her granddaughter, stability for the foundation, and rapid expansion. But in exchange, she would lose control of what she had so carefully created. Now, with her speech reverberating across the country, the market's eyes were once again pressing her. Bigger offers were emerging by the hour. Miles, upon hearing the proposal, hesitated. He wanted the method to reach everyone, but he knew that over-commercializing it could dilute what was most precious, the soul. Clara was faced with a new dilemma, the kind that can't be resolved with pure reason nor with raw emotion. It was a decision about power, about essence, and about the future of everything she had built. Deep down, she knew this choice wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who would be touched by what she decided to do, and she had little time. The world awaited an answer, but what would Clara Davis do? That was the question that now hung in the air, and the answer was yet to come. On the morning Clara Davis would deliver her definitive answer to the educational conglomerate, the sky dawned cloudy over Charlotte. The kind of sky that doesn't portend a storm, but carries a kind of dense silence, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for an important decision. Clara woke early, as always. She made coffee, walked through the hallways of the house with light, firm steps, and stopped at the library window, the same place where weeks ago Caleb had first welcomed her as an equal. Now he waited upstairs, respecting her space and time, something that had previously seemed impossible for a man so accustomed to controlling schedules, deadlines, and destinies. Clara opened the envelope containing the revised proposal on the table. The numbers were almost absurd. The value of the deal surpassed anything she had imagined earning in a lifetime. But the contract made it clear the method would lose its name. She would become merely a historical consultant, with no creative power or voice in the final decisions. She would be a legend erased in fine print. Her creation would become a product, polished, plasticized, diluted. Miles entered the room silently. He carried a leather briefcase containing a prototype teaching material he'd been developing for the past few days. He was beaming. Ideas were growing in his head with the speed of someone who discovered they could use their past as a bridge, not a prison. But when he saw Clara's face, he stopped. "Are you still thinking about it?" She nodded. "Some people think accepting it would be selling me out. Others say it's a chance to get the method to those who need it faster. Miles approached. And you, what do you feel? She looked at him tenderly. I feel like my whole life I've been taught to take what I'm given, to not turn down opportunities, but now, for the first time, I can choose. And then, she smiled, closed the envelope and replied with the firmness that only someone who has lived through everything can have. I choose to remain whole. Hours later, Clara called a press conference. Everyone was there, journalists, teachers, government representatives, educators from across the country. And in her calm voice, without needing to raise her voice, she explained that she had declined the proposal. She said she would not build an empire based on a method born of listening, empathy, and collective experience. She announced that she would found an independent network for training educators, the Invisible School, aimed at professionals who wanted to learn from real-life experiences outside of major cities and whose methodology would be available as open source so any teacher anywhere could access it. Free, no intermediaries, no product labels, just real human and transformative content. The impact was immediate. The network began to grow organically. Within months, small community rooms in New Orleans, Detroit, Oakland, and forgotten parts of Baltimore were implementing the methodology with results that impressed even the most skeptical. Clara didn't seek fame, but she became a global figurehead. Conferences around the world began inviting her, and she accepted only a few, those willing to truly listen to her, not just use her as a showcase for diversity. Caleb, for his part, stepped back from the spotlight. He decided to sell part of the company, remain only on the board, and spend more time on what he called the most difficult construction of my life, his relationship with his son. He began volunteering on the board of the Invisible School Foundation, using his influence only where necessary, without trying to impose his views. When asked about the sudden change, he simply replied, "Some things money buys, others we have to earn." Miles found his path. He entered a public university, opting for an interdisciplinary program that combined psychology and education. He spent part of his time in the field, helping young people with learning disabilities in marginalized communities, and part of his time writing his own material, based on an adaptation of Clara's method for adolescents with attention deficit disorder. The blank notebook she had given him was now filled with drawings, diagrams, sentences, and random notes. It had become his diary of ideas. But more than that, it was living proof that he had found his voice. Clara continued living in the same house. Caleb repeatedly offered her her own apartment, a house in her name and lifelong security. She refused everything. She said she liked to hear the sound of the cleaning cart's wheels rolling down the hallway, that she liked to remember who she was, not out of nostalgia, but out of respect. When Nia, her granddaughter, was accepted to Howard with a full scholarship, she cried again, but this time standing staring at the horizon as if she had finally seen the future arrive. On a quiet evening, months after the conference, Miles sat beside Clara in the mansion's backyard. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. "Do you think it will ever end?" he asked. "What?" "This feeling that there is always something else to do, someone else to save one more system, to change." She smiled serenely. "It doesn't end, but it changes. Eventually you understand that you don't have to carry everything. You just need to keep the path clear for those who come after you." They sat in silence for a long time, staring up at the sky. And in that moment, Miles understood. His story, which began as the insecure son of an impenetrable man, was now the story of someone who had broken a cycle, and that was bigger than any test or diploma. Clara's story, which began with the pain of erasure, was now the story of a woman who refused to be a showcase and chose to be a root, who transformed wisdom into a seed, trauma into learning, silence into a tool, who proved without shouting that the world only changes when someone has the courage to refuse to bow to what seems easiest. And that's why, even after everything, Clara continued to be the one who, with a bucket of cloth and a notebook in her hands, taught a lost boy that there is more than one way to be brilliant, and that sometimes the truest of them is born in the darkness, hidden from everyone's eyes. Now let me ask you a question. How many Claras have you ignored in your life? How many voices have you stopped listening to just because they didn't speak the way you expected? What if the next great inventor, healer, educator, or leader is right now slipping under the radar with ideas burning in their chest and fear in their eyes? We live in a world that values titles more than careers, speeches more than listening. But perhaps what the world needs most is exactly the opposite. Comment below on how you felt after hearing this story. Tell me if it touched you in any way, if it reminded you of someone, if it made you think differently. I'd love to hear it. And of course, if you want to keep hearing stories like this with emotion, surprise, twists and turns, and soul, subscribe to the Tales of Twist channel, activate the bell, and leave a like. Here, the next story could change everything. And you won't want to miss it.